My name is Laila, and I am 38 years old. I had not even recovered from my emergency C-section when my husband threw divorce papers onto my hospital bed. He looked at our newborn daughter sleeping in the plastic bassinet and called her a blood-sucking burden that would drag his career down. Then he emptied our bank accounts and boarded a first-class flight to Dubai with his mistress. 18 years later, he kicked open the doors of my corporate office, demanding his parental rights and a piece of my wealth. He thought I was still the broke, weeping girl he abandoned in that sterile room. But when he finally realized exactly who my daughter had become, and who actually owned the massive debt he was drowning in, the color completely drained from his arrogant face. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned the worst betrayal of your life into the foundation of your empire. The heart monitor beside my bed beeped in a steady, rhythmic, mocking tone. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a harsh glare over the tiny hospital room in downtown Atlanta. My lower abdomen felt like it had been sliced open with a dull blade. I shifted my weight against the stiff pillows, wincing as a fresh wave of agony radiated from my incision. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the nightmare unfolding at the foot of my bed. Terrence, my husband of 3 years, stood there in a sharp, custom-tailored suit that we could not afford. He was adjusting his expensive silk tie, looking everywhere except at me, or the clear plastic crib holding our newborn daughter Amara. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and tossed it casually onto my lap. It landed heavily against my numb legs. "Sign them," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. My lawyer expedited the paperwork. "I am leaving Laila." I stared at the envelope. My mind felt thick from the heavy pain medication, but the bold letters spelling out petition for dissolution of marriage brought everything into sharp, terrifying focus. I looked up at him, my hands shaking as I gripped the thin hospital blanket. "We just had a baby, Terrence," I whispered, my throat raw from the breathing tube they used during surgery. "What are you talking about?" He let out an exasperated sigh, rolling his eyes like I was a difficult client wasting his valuable time. "Do not do this whole dramatic act, Laila," he snapped, checking his gold watch. "I have a flight to catch. I got an investment opportunity in Dubai. I cannot be tied down by a wife who brings absolutely nothing to the table and a screaming infant. You and that baby are just a burden to me. A massive, expensive anchor around my neck." I felt the air leave my lungs. A burden. I had worked double shifts as a waitress to put him through his sketchy business seminars. I had paid the rent while he chased phantom cryptocurrency millions. Before I could even form a response, a soft, patronizing click of the tongue came from the corner of the room. Heather, his brother Jamal's wife, stepped out of the shadows. She was a petite white woman with an expensive blonde bob and a perpetual look of polite pity plastered across her face. She crossed her arms over her pastel cashmere sweater and tilted her head, aiming her signature condescending gaze right at me. "Now, Laila, let us just take a deep breath and use our inside voices," Heather said, her tone dripping with that familiar, sickening sweetness. "I know your people tend to get a little loud and aggressive when you are emotional, but Terrence is under an immense amount of pressure. You need to dial down your inherent hostile nature and look at this logically." My blood boiled. Heather had been slipping these quiet, racist microaggressions into family dinners for years, always disguised as helpful advice. "Aggressive," I choked out, clutching my stomach as a sharp pain shot through my core. "He is abandoning his day-old child, and you are telling me to watch my tone." Heather sighed softly, looking at Terrence with exaggerated sympathy. "See, Terrence, this is exactly what we talked about. The hostile environment. You cannot thrive financially or spiritually when you are surrounded by this kind of combative energy. You need to go find your freedom." Terrence nodded solemnly, as if Heather had just delivered a profound sermon. "You are right, Heather. I cannot let her negative mindset hold me back anymore." He walked over to my bedside table. My purse was sitting there. Without a shred of hesitation, he unzipped it and pulled out my wallet. "What are you doing?" I demanded, trying to sit up, but the searing pain in my abdomen forced me back down. "Liquidating my assets," he replied coolly. He pulled out the debit card linked to our joint account, the account that held every dollar I had saved for Amaris nursery and my maternity leave. "I already transferred the balance to my private offshore account this morning. You can keep the credit cards. They are maxed out anyway." Tears of sheer disbelief pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You are stealing my money, Terrence. You are leaving your daughter with nothing. How are we supposed to survive?" "That sounds like a you problem," he sneered. "You always bragged about being a strong, independent black woman, right? So go be strong. Figure it out." He turned on his heel and strode toward the door. Heather lingered for a second longer, offering me a tragic little smile. "I will pray for you and the baby Layla," she whispered softly. "I really hope you find peace with your situation instead of holding on to anger. It is so bad for your health." Then she turned and followed him out, leaving the door wide open. The sound of Terrence's expensive leather shoes echoed down the linoleum hallway, growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing left but the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor and the soft breathing of my newborn daughter. I lay there in the sterile silence, staring at the ceiling. I had $0 to my name. My credit was destroyed. My body was broken. The man I loved had just discarded me like garbage on the absolute most vulnerable day of my life, while his sister-in-law mocked my pain. I was utterly alone. Amara let out a tiny, quiet whimper from her bassinet. I turned my head to look at her. She was so small, so fragile, completely dependent on a mother who had just been stripped of everything. I reached over, gritting my teeth against the fire burning in my stomach, and rested my hand against the clear plastic of her crib. A strange sensation washed over me, pushing away the panic and the despair. It was cold, hard, absolute clarity. I did not cry. I did not scream. The weeping broken girl Terrence thought he left behind died the second he walked out that door. I pushed the thin hospital blanket off my legs. The cold air hit my skin, but I barely registered it. I looked at the back of my hand where the thick plastic IV tube was taped down, feeding pain medication into my veins. Terrence wanted me to be weak. Heather wanted me to be a broken stereotype they could pity at their fancy dinner parties. I reached over and ripped the medical tape right off my skin. The sudden sting was sharp. I pulled the needle out of my vein. A small drop of blood welled up and spilled over my knuckles. I pressed a cotton swab against it, holding it tight. I was done bleeding for them. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The incision from my surgery screamed in protest, but I forced myself to stand. I gripped the edge of the mattress until my knuckles turned white. Every breath felt like glass in my lungs, but I was not going to let them win. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. My hands were shaking, but my mind was moving 1,000,000 miles an hour. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Professor Harrison. He was the head of the forensic accounting department at my university. 6 months ago, he had offered me a spot in the most grueling competitive internship program in the city. It was at a top-tier financial risk management firm. I had turned it down because Terrence told me it would take too much time away from supporting his fake entrepreneurial dreams. I pressed call and brought the phone to my ear. It rang twice before he answered. "Professor Harrison, it is Layla," I said, my voice steady despite the pain radiating through my core. He sounded completely shocked to hear from me, knowing I had just given birth a day ago. He asked if everything was all right. I told him I made a mistake. I told him I wanted the internship and I was ready to start on Monday. He paused for a long time. He reminded me the hours were brutal and the partners were absolutely ruthless. He warned me that they demanded perfection and would not care about my personal life or my new baby. He asked if I was absolutely sure I could handle the pressure. I looked at my newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her plastic bassinet. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my entire life. I told him I would outwork every single person in that building. He took a deep breath and told me to be at the office at 8 sharp. I hung up the phone. I slowly walked over to the small closet and pulled out the sweatpants and oversized shirt I had packed in my hospital bag. Pulling them on over my bandages was pure agony, but with every painful movement my resolve hardened into stone. I thought about Terrence's family, They had always hated me from the very beginning. They came from old Atlanta money and legacy wealth. They were the exact kind of people who cared far more about pedigree and exclusive country club memberships than actual human character. They flaunted their generational wealth like a weapon to keep outsiders away. When Terrence first brought me home to meet them, his mother had looked me up and down like I was something she stepped on in the street. I grew up strictly working class. My mother cleaned corporate office buildings at night, and my father worked double shifts at a heavy manufacturing plant just to keep the lights on and food on our table. We did not have massive trust funds or fancy summer homes. We had grit and survival skills. But to Terrence's family, I was nothing more than a cheap gold digger trying to climb their pristine social ladder. They constantly whispered about my affordable clothes. They made passive-aggressive remarks about the rough neighborhood where I grew up. Heather was honestly the worst of them all. She had married into the family a year before me, coming from some wealthy Connecticut suburb with a massive trust fund. She absolutely loved playing the gracious white savior, constantly offering me her old designer clothes, or suggesting I take high society etiquette classes to fit in better. They all truly thought I was completely beneath them. They thought I was just a temporary distraction that Terrence would eventually discard when he got bored. And today they finally got their wicked wish. But they had made one massive fatal miscalculation. They arrogantly assumed that taking away my financial safety net would permanently destroy me. They did not realize that without a safety net, I had absolutely nothing left to do but climb higher than they could ever reach. I walked over to the crib and looked down at Amara. She was so tiny, wrapping her little fingers around the fuzzy edge of her hospital blanket. Terrence actually called her a burden. He looked at his own beautiful flesh and blood and saw nothing but a heavy anchor weighing down his fake lifestyle. I reached in and gently lifted her into my arms. She felt so incredibly light, but she grounded my soul completely. I held her against my chest, smelling the sweet baby lotion the nurses had used after her bath. I whispered to her right then and there, making a vow I intended to keep. I promised her she would never ever have to beg for a seat at their elitist table. I promised her we were going to build our very own table, and we were going to own the entire skyscraper it sat inside. I was going to take the corporate forensic accounting world by storm. I would learn every single tax loophole, every complex financial trap, and every hidden asset strategy the rich use to protect their dirty wealth. I would become the very person they feared most in business. I would become the woman who controlled all the numbers. I grabbed my heavy duffel bag with my free hand. The discharge nurse walked into the room just as I was heading for the door. She looked completely horrified seeing me standing up fully dressed and completely disconnected from the vital monitors. She rushed over and told me I could not leave under any circumstances. She said I desperately needed at least 2 more days of strict bed rest to heal properly from the major abdominal surgery. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I simply did not have the luxury of time to rest. I demanded the paperwork. I signed the release forms against strict medical advice, completely ignoring her frantic protests and warnings. I walked right out of that sterile hospital room and marched straight down the long, bright fluorescent hallway. Every single step sent massive shockwaves of burning pain through my healing body, but I absolutely did not stop. I did not look back even once. I carried my beautiful daughter through the automatic sliding glass doors and stepped out into the humid, thick Atlanta morning. The bright sun was blinding against my tired eyes. The loud city noise washed over me like a wave. I had $0 in my bank account. I had a maxed-out credit card and a newborn baby in my aching arms. But as I stood there on the hot pavement hailing a yellow cab to take us back to a quiet, empty apartment, I felt something I had never ever felt while I was married to Terrence. I felt truly powerful. I was going to absolutely crush their pathetic arrogance with sheer, undeniable, absolute success. They desperately wanted to see me broken and begging. Instead, they were going to watch me completely conquer their entire world. The first few years were a blur of absolute exhaustion and relentless grinding. Professor Harrison was absolutely right about the firm. The environment was a toxic shark tank designed to break anyone who showed even a sliver of weakness. I was the only black woman on a floor of 60 white men who looked at me like a quota filler. They gave me the impossible cases, the dead-end audits, and the messy divorces where millions of dollars had seemingly vanished into thin air. They fully expected me to fail and quit. Instead, I thrived. I lived on black coffee and pure burning spite. I would sit in my tiny, cramped apartment, rocking a crying Amara with my left arm, while my right hand clicked through thousands of pages of encrypted bank statements. I did not sleep. I hunted. Forensic accounting is not just about math, it is about understanding human greed. I learned how desperate men hide their money. I tracked shell companies in the Cayman Islands and untangled complex webs of offshore real estate holdings. Whenever a senior partner tried to steal the credit for my discoveries, I would quietly present the immutable metadata to the managing directors, completely destroying the careers of my rivals in the process. I did not play office politics. I played to win. Within 5 years, I was the most feared asset in the building. By my 10th year, they had no choice but to offer me a junior partnership because I threatened to take my wealthy clients to our biggest competitor. By my 15th year, I sat at the head of the long mahogany table as a senior partner. I controlled the wealth management division. I was no longer the terrified girl bleeding in a hospital bed. I was the architect of my own empire. When I received my first 7-figure partnership distribution, I did not buy designer clothes or flashy sports cars. I bought a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. It was a massive modern fortress of steel and glass, hidden behind towering iron gates and perfectly manicured hedges. I specifically chose a property right in the heart of the exact same zip code that the family of Terrence claimed as their exclusive kingdom. My house was twice the size of their outdated colonial home. But unlike their decaying ancestral wealth, my fortune was built on blood sweat and an absolutely flawless understanding of tax law. I walked through my massive marble hallways feeling the cool stone under my feet and knew I had finally built a sanctuary they could never breach. But my greatest masterpiece was not my career or my bank accounts. It was Amara. From the moment she could talk, I refused to feed her the same delusional fairy tales that society feeds young girls. I did not read her stories about helpless princesses waiting in towers for a prince to rescue them. Instead, I sat her on my lap in my home office and taught her how to read corporate balance sheets. While other children were learning their multiplication tables, Amara was learning about compound interest asset allocation and capital gains taxes. She was a natural. She had a brilliant calculating mind that absorbed numbers like a sponge. I raised her to be a wolf in a world full of sheep. I taught her that love is conditional, but financial independence is absolute. By the time she was 12, she could spot a discrepancy in a profit and loss statement faster than most of my junior analysts. I built her a state-of-the-art server room in our Buckhead mansion, where she taught herself advanced coding and data analytics. She did not care about the trivial drama of high school. She cared about algorithms and market trends. Now she was 18 years old and absolutely formidable. She was a stunning young woman who carried herself with a cold, quiet confidence that intimidated grown men. She had just been accepted into Spelman College, the most prestigious historically black college for women in the entire country. She was entering as a freshman, but she already had the investment portfolio of a seasoned Wall Street trader. I looked at her and saw everything I had fought so hard to protect. She did not know Terrence. She did not know the sound of his voice or the cowardice in his eyes. She only knew the unshakable foundation we had built together. For 18 years, we lived in our high-rise glass towers, completely separated from the toxic family that threw us away like garbage. I had entirely forgotten about Terrence. I assumed he had either drank himself to death in his fake Dubai paradise or ended up rotting in some federal prison for his pathetic cryptocurrency scams. I never spent a single second of my precious time looking him up on social media or asking mutual acquaintances about his pathetic life. I was far too busy orchestrating my own massive triumphs. My world was pristine and highly controlled, but the universe has a very twisted sense of humor. Just when you think you have completely sanitized your life, the ghosts of your past find a way to crawl out of the gutters. It was late October when the crisp autumn air settled over Atlanta. Amara and I were preparing for one of the most important social events of the season. We had secured our place in the elite circles of the city, and tonight was supposed to be a celebration of everything we had achieved. I had no idea that the carefully constructed walls of my empire were about to be tested by the very people who tried to bury me alive all those years ago. The event was the annual Autumn Gala hosted by the Jack and Jill Society. It was an extremely exclusive gathering for the most affluent and influential Black families in the South. Years ago, the mother of Terrence had actually laughed in my face when I mentioned wanting to join their local chapter. She told me the organization was reserved for families with genuine legacy and proper breeding, not ambitious girls from the wrong side of the tracks. Tonight, I was attending not just as a member, but as one of the primary corporate sponsors of their entire scholarship fund. Amara was wearing a stunning emerald green gown that perfectly complemented her dark skin, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water while discussing macroeconomic theory with a state senator. I stood near the edge of the grand ballroom watching her with immense pride. We had won. We had completely rewritten our destiny. But the heavy oak doors of the ballroom were about to swing open and drag the ugly past right back into my beautiful present. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the grand ballroom suddenly faltered. A loud commotion at the main entrance drew the eyes of every senator, judge, and corporate executive in the room. The tables were draped in heavy white silk and covered in towering floral arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas. The air smelled of expensive perfume and catered roasted duck. I turned my head slowly, gripping the stem of my crystal champagne flute. The heavy mahogany doors were shoved open violently. Two venue security guards were trying desperately to hold back a trio of very loud, very out-of-place intruders. But before the guards could completely block the grand entrance, the three of them pushed their way into the center of the foyer, acting as if they owned the entire luxury hotel. It was Terrence, Jamal, and Heather. I felt my breath catch in my throat for just a fraction of a second. It had been 18 long years, but the sheer arrogance in Terrence's walk was exactly the same. He was wearing a ridiculously flashy metallic blue suit that looked incredibly cheap under the elegant crystal chandeliers. He had a thick gold chain resting over a black silk shirt that was unbuttoned far too low for a formal black tie gala. On his wrist sat a fake gold Rolex that caught the light in all the wrong ways. He looked exactly like a man desperately trying to project massive wealth to cover up his own crippling insecurity. Jamal was trailing slightly behind him, looking sweaty and nervous in a poorly fitted tuxedo that was clearly rented from a strip mall. And then there was Heather. She had somehow managed to age terribly while still maintaining her absolute lack of self-awareness. She was wearing an overly elaborate sequined dress that looked more appropriate for a cheap Vegas nightclub than an exclusive philanthropic gala. Her blonde hair was teased high, and she had a deeply unnatural orange spray tan. She looked around the room with a mix of awe and deep jealousy, pretending to be comfortable, but clearly out of her depth. She was aggressively waving away the security guards, putting on her best victim face, and loudly proclaiming that they were on the VIP guest list. "Do you know who I am?" Terrence bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I am an international crypto developer. My family is here. I am here to see my daughter." The entire ballroom went dead silent. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates stopped completely. Every single eye in the room darted back and forth between the loud disruptors at the door and the elegant guests trying to ignore them. I felt Amara step closer to my side. She did not look scared or intimidated. She looked profoundly annoyed. I gently placed my hand on her arm, signaling her to let me handle the situation. Terrence scanned the prestigious crowd, and his eyes finally locked onto me. A smug, predatory smile spread across his face. He adjusted his jacket and began to strut across the ballroom floor. He walked right past tables of bewildered philanthropists, acting as if the elite crowd had gathered specifically to celebrate his grand return from Dubai. Jamal and Heather followed closely behind him, like pathetic lackeys eager to share in his fake glory. Laila, Terrence shouted, spreading his arms wide as if he was waiting for an embrace. "Look at you! You actually clean up pretty well for a girl from the South Side? And this must be my beautiful little girl." He turned his gaze toward Amara. He reached out a hand as if he was going to touch her bare shoulder. Before I could even step in front of her, Amara took a very deliberate, very cold step backward. She looked him up and down, with eyes so calculating and lifeless, he actually pulled his hand back in hesitation. "Who is this man?" Amara asked, her voice steady and loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear clearly. She did not sound angry. She sounded completely indifferent, which I knew would hurt his massive ego far more than any loud insult. Terrence let out a loud, fake laugh that sounded incredibly hollow. "Come on now, sweetheart. Do not play coy with your old man. It is me, your father. I know I have been away building my international investment portfolio in Dubai, but I am back now. We have a whole lot of catching up to do." Before Amara could respond, Heather pushed her way to the front. She let out a loud dramatic gasp and pressed both of her hands against her sequined chest. "Oh my goodness, Laila," she squealed, her voice piercing through the quiet tension of the room. "Look at how big she is. And look at you surrounded by all these nice people. We are just so incredibly proud of you for overcoming your impoverished background and making something of yourself." Heather reached out and tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back smoothly, completely avoiding her touch. She pouted her lips, acting as if my personal boundary was a direct attack on her kindness. "Now, Laila, do not be like that." Heather continued, raising her voice so the nearby senators' wives could hear every single word. "We are family. We know you have held a lot of deep resentment over the years. We know how difficult it is for single mothers from your demographic to raise children without a strong male figure in the home. But Terrence is here now to step up and be the man of the house. You do not have to be so angry and defensive anymore. We forgive you for keeping her away from us." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air like toxic smoke. She was doing exactly what she did in that hospital room 18 years ago. She was trying to paint me as the bitter, aggressive black woman, while framing Terrence as the generous, forgiving savior. She wanted the elite crowd to see them as the high-class family, trying to rescue a troubled single mother. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one who funded the very floor she was standing on. I kept my face completely blank. A true stoic never lets the enemy see them sweat. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I did not raise my voice. I did not snap. I looked at Terrence, who was grinning like he had already won the lottery. I knew this was not a random sweet reunion. Terrence did not care about being a father. He did not fly all the way back from Dubai and crash a high society gala just to play house. He wanted something big. Men like him only return to the scenes of their crimes when they are desperate. I calmly set my crystal glass down on the white linen tablecloth beside me. I could see the security director of the hotel rushing over with 4 large men in dark suits, ready to drag them out into the street. The entire ballroom was watching, waiting to see how the senior partner of the most ruthless firm in the city would handle this public humiliation. They expected me to call the guards. They expected a massive scene. But I raised a single finger toward the security director, signaling him to stop and stand by. If Terrence wanted an audience, I was going to give him one. I looked back at the 3 of them standing there in all their fake rented glory. They were a trio of absolute failures, trying to invade a room full of apex predators. They thought they were crashing my party to intimidate me. They were far too stupid to realize they had just walked right into a slaughterhouse. Terrence took another step forward, holding his hands up in a gesture of fake surrender. "I just want to talk, Laila," he said, lowering his voice to sound incredibly sincere. "It has been a long time and a lot has changed. We are older and wiser now. I have built a massive portfolio overseas, but family is what truly matters." I did not blink. I just stared at the cheap, shiny fabric of his blue suit. A man who truly possessed international wealth would never wear a polyester blend to a high society event. Amara stood perfectly still next to me, her face an absolute mask of cold indifference. She was scanning him from head to toe, analyzing his posture and his rapid blinking. She was evaluating him like a high-risk junk bond. Terence cleared his throat, looking a bit nervous under our silent, unwavering scrutiny. He shifted his weight and continued his rehearsed speech. "You know, my grandmother passed away a few months ago," he said, wiping a fake invisible tear from his eye. "It was a huge, devastating loss for our family. The reading of her will really opened my eyes. It made me realize how incredibly short life is and how much precious time I have wasted away from my firstborn child." There it was. The bait was dropped. I knew immediately he did not fly thousands of miles in economy class just to mourn his bitter old grandmother. The matriarch of his family was a cruel, controlling woman who guarded her massive assets with an iron fist. She owned hundreds of acres of prime, undeveloped commercial land just outside the Atlanta city limits. It was ancestral land that had been in their family for multiple generations. Heather stepped up right beside Terence, nodding vigorously. "It was such a beautiful service, Laila," she said, her voice thick with fake sympathy. "We all missed you and Amara so much. Grandma really wanted the family to stay united in the end. That is why she left her entire estate strictly to her direct blood relatives. It was a very specific non-negotiable clause in her final will and testament." I pieced the entire puzzle together in a fraction of a second. Terence had married a woman named Victoria in Dubai shortly after he abandoned us. Victoria had a child from a previous relationship. That meant Terence had absolutely no biological children with his new wife. According to the strict bloodline clause in the will of his grandmother, Amara was the sole rightful heir to that massive plot of ancestral land. Terence gave a heavy, exaggerated sigh. "You see, Laila, the estate lawyers are being completely unreasonable right now," he said, shaking his head sadly. "They are tying up the estate in endless, complicated probate court hearings. The land requires constant physical maintenance and the property taxes are absolutely astronomical. I know you are probably struggling just to keep up with your own basic living expenses. I do not want to burden my little girl with that kind of massive, terrifying financial responsibility." He looked at Amara with a fake expression of deep, fatherly concern. "You are just a young kid, sweetheart," he said softly, trying to sound gentle. "You should be focusing entirely on your college classes and hanging out with your little friends. You do not need to be stressing over millions of dollars in corporate real estate liabilities. That is a difficult job for a grown man. That is my job as your father." I almost laughed out loud at his sheer, absolute stupidity. He honestly thought he could march into this elegant ballroom and trick us with simple buzzwords. He wanted me to sign over the legal guardianship of the massive asset. He desperately needed my signature as her mother to legally appoint him as the primary financial manager of the estate. He thought I was ignorant enough to blindly hand over the rights to land worth tens of millions of dollars just because he used the scary word, liability. Jamal chimed in nervously from the back. "Yeah, Laila, it is just a whole lot of boring legal paperwork," he stammered, rubbing the back of his sweaty neck. "Terence has a whole massive team of international lawyers ready to go. He can easily manage the property and make sure you and Amara get a nice little monthly allowance out of it. It is clearly the best thing for everyone involved." An allowance? They literally wanted to steal a fortune and toss us a few miserable crumbs like starving dogs. My brilliant mind raced through the municipal zoning data I had casually reviewed over the past few years for my corporate clients. The specific area where that ancestral land was located was currently undergoing a massive, unprecedented commercial boom. Major tech giants were aggressively buying up every single available acre to build massive data centers. That undisturbed dirt was worth significantly more than solid gold. Terence took another step closer, his cheap, overpowering cologne wafting through the crisp air of the ballroom. "All I need is for you to sign a simple conservatorship agreement, Laila," he said smoothly, pulling a folded white document from his inside jacket pocket. "It just grants me the basic legal authority to handle the complex tax issues on behalf of Amara. It will save you both a massive financial headache. We can go to a public notary tomorrow morning and get it all sorted out quickly. Then we can finally be a real happy family again." He held the folded paper out toward me. His hand was trembling slightly. That tiny involuntary tremor told me absolutely everything I needed to know about his current situation. This was not a calculated business move for him. This was sheer, utter panic. A truly successful international crypto developer does not shake when handing over a simple family contract. A desperate man drowning in massive unforgiving debt shakes. Heather reached out and gently touched the arm of Terrence, playing the perfect role of the supportive peacemaker. "He is trying so hard, Laila," she whispered loudly, making sure the surrounding wealthy guests heard her. "Please do not let your stubborn pride ruin this beautiful opportunity for family healing. Let Terrence take this heavy burden off your exhausted shoulders. You have carried enough heavy weight over the past 18 years. The word burden echoed loudly in my mind. 18 years ago, he used that exact same hateful word to describe my beautiful newborn daughter as she slept in her hospital bassinet. Now he was using it to describe her rightful inheritance. He wanted to strip her of her powerful legacy just like he callously stripped me of my dignity in that cold, sterile room. I looked down at the document in his shaking hand. I did not reach for it. I simply let it hover uselessly in the empty space between us. Amara stood perfectly still beside me, her face completely unreadable. She knew exactly what I was doing. She knew I was patiently letting them dig their own graves right here in the middle of the grand ballroom floor. Terrence lowered his hand slightly, his fake confident smile faltering just a fraction of an inch under my cold gaze. "Come on, Laila," he pushed, trying to regain his dominant posture. "Do not be difficult about this. I am trying to do the right thing here. I am trying to protect my daughter." I looked him dead in the eye, letting the heavy silence stretch on for several excruciating seconds. The surrounding elite guests were pretending to casually mingle, but I knew they were hanging on to every single breathless word. Heather could not stand the heavy silence. She thrives on chaotic drama and desperately needs to be the center of attention in any room she enters. Seeing my cold refusal to engage with Terrence, she stepped right into the middle of the tense standoff. She turned away from me and actually addressed the surrounding crowd of elite guests, raising her voice so it echoed across the grand ballroom. "Excuse me, everyone," Heather announced, placing her hand over her heart in a gesture of profound fake sorrow. "I know this appears to be a simple domestic dispute, but it is actually a tragic example of a much larger systemic issue. We all know how incredibly important it is for young women of color to have a strong male figure in their lives. Terrence has worked so hard to overcome his struggles and return to his community as a successful provider. But Laila is engaging in textbook parental alienation. I watched her perform her little one-woman show, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical fascination. She was standing in a room full of highly educated, incredibly wealthy Black professionals, and she honestly thought she could lecture them about our community. She was wearing her white savior complex like a cheap badge of honor, completely blind to the disgusted looks spreading across the faces of the judges, politicians, and CEOs watching her. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the people in this room had spent their entire lives fighting against the exact same patronizing stereotypes she was currently weaponizing. The audacity was almost impressive in its sheer, utter stupidity. She is letting her own bitter personal resentment destroy the fragile psyche of a young woman of color. Heather continued, her voice trembling with forced emotion. "It is so toxic and damaging. Amara needs her father. She needs his guidance to navigate this difficult world and manage her future assets. We are just trying to break the cycle of broken homes, and Laila is standing in the way of true family healing." Jamal nodded vigorously beside his wife, completely oblivious to the fact that she was publicly humiliating him and his brother. Terrence stood tall, trying to look like a noble martyr who was being unfairly persecuted by an angry, unreasonable ex-wife. He looked around the room, expecting the elite crowd to nod in agreement and suddenly rally to his defense. Instead, he was met with absolute icy disdain. The senator standing at the table next to us slowly placed his silver fork down and glared at Heather as if she was a cockroach that had just crawled out of the luxury catering kitchen. I looked at Amara. She was not upset. She was actually highly amused. She tilted her head slightly, watching Heather rant and rave like a malfunctioning robot. Amara had been raised in ruthless boardrooms and high-stakes negotiation meetings. She knew exactly what a desperate failing strategy looked like. She looked up at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was time to end the circus. I calmly reached for my crystal glass of sparkling water and took a slow, elegant sip. The cold liquid coated my throat. I set the glass back down on the pristine white tablecloth, making a soft clinking sound that somehow cut right through the rambling speech Heather was still giving. I raised my left hand and caught the eye of the hotel security director. I gave him a single sharp nod. Instantly, 4 massive security guards in dark tailored suits stepped out from the shadows of the arched doorways. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. Before Terrence could even process what was happening, 2 guards grabbed him firmly by the arms. A third guard stepped between Jamal and Heather, using his sheer physical size to herd them forcefully toward the grand exit. "Wait! What are you doing?" Terrence shouted, struggling vainly against the iron grip of the guards. "You cannot do this. I am an international investor. I am on the VIP list. I have legal rights to be here." Heather let out a loud, dramatic shriek as a guard firmly directed her toward the door. "This is discrimination," she yelled, thrashing her thin arms. "You are proving my exact point, Laila. You are aggressive and completely unhinged. You cannot hide from the law forever. We will take you to court. We will take everything." I picked up my small silk evening clutch from the table. I opened the gold clasp and reached inside my fingers, brushing against the heavy premium cardstock of my business cards. They were custom-printed matte black with gold foil lettering detailing my name and my title as senior partner of the wealth management division. I pulled one out and walked slowly toward the struggling, pathetic trio as the guards dragged them backward toward the towering mahogany doors. Terrence was red in the face, sweating profusely and screaming desperate threats about his imaginary team of global lawyers. I stopped just a few feet away from him. The guards paused for a brief second, waiting for my final command. "If you are so incredibly eager to discuss the legal guardianship of my daughter and the management of her massive financial assets," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level, "then you do not need to crash a charity gala in a rented polyester suit. You can schedule an appointment with my office like a real businessman." I held the matte black business card between my index and middle finger. I did not hand it to him. I simply opened my fingers and let the heavy card flutter to the polished marble floor. It landed perfectly at the tip of his cheap, scuffed leather shoe. Terrence scrambled against the grip of the security guards, frantically kicking his foot out to drag the heavy cardstock closer to him. It was a pathetic display of a man desperately grasping at what he believed was his golden ticket out of crushing debt. "Have your imaginary lawyers call me Terrence," I added, turning my back on him before he could even form a coherent response. The guards immediately shoved them out into the lobby. The loud, panicked shouting of Heather and Terrence was abruptly cut off as the thick mahogany doors slammed shut, echoing with a highly satisfying thud across the silent ballroom. For a moment, the room remained completely still. Then the string quartet seamlessly resumed, playing their elegant classical music. The gentle hum of polite high society conversation slowly returned as the guests went back to their roasted duck and expensive wine, pretending the trash had never even entered the building. I walked back over to Amara, who was already checking a notification on her phone. She looked up at me with a sharp, calculating smile. "Did you really just give them your direct office line?" she asked, her tone laced with dark amusement. "I did," I replied, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my emerald green gown. "He is going to take that card and run straight to his shady strip mall," attorney Amara pointed out, slipping her phone back into her designer clutch. "He probably thinks you are too afraid of a public scandal to fight him in open court. He is going to think you caved to his public pressure and that you are willing to negotiate over the land just to protect your pristine reputation." "Exactly," I replied, a slow, predatory smile finally spreading across my face. "He thinks I am a cornered animal, giving him a desperate way out." He does not realize I just handed him the exact address of the slaughterhouse. Let him gather his fake lawyers and his pathetic brother. We are going to let them walk right into the trap. The bait was perfectly set. Terrence was arrogant and desperate enough to swallow it whole. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of emotional intimidation. But he was about to learn that in the high-stakes world of corporate forensic accounting, we do not just defeat our enemies. We meticulously dismantle their entire lives until there is absolutely nothing left but dust. The morning after the gala, I woke up to my phone vibrating aggressively on my marble nightstand. It was barely 6 in the morning, but the digital world was already completely on fire. I picked up the device and saw dozens of missed calls and forwarded screenshots from various acquaintances and junior partners at my firm. I opened the first message and was immediately greeted by a massive wall of text written by Heather. She had taken her pathetic victim act straight to Facebook and the private group chats of her mega church. The post was a masterclass in white savior manipulation and fake Christian outrage. She attached a heavily edited photo of Terrence looking mournfully out of a window. Below it, she wrote a sprawling essay about how her poor brother-in-law had returned from his successful international business ventures only to be violently rejected by his bitter, greedy ex-wife. She claimed that I had hired heavily armed thugs to physically assault them at a charity event just to keep Terrence away from his beloved daughter. She used words like toxic gold digger and aggressive alienator. She painted me as a money-hungry monster who was holding a young girl hostage out of sheer spite. Jamal was right there in the comments acting as her pathetic echo chamber. He replied to her post with a long, rambling paragraph about how I had always hated their family because I was jealous of their legacy and high-class upbringing. He claimed I was deeply mentally unstable and unfit to manage the massive inheritance that their grandmother had left behind. He actually had the absolute nerve to tell his church congregation that they needed to pray for my dark, twisted soul, while simultaneously asking for donations to help Terrence fund a massive legal battle to rescue Amara. The family bandwagon was incredibly swift and absolutely vicious. Aunts, uncles, and distant cousins who had not spoken to me in almost 2 decades suddenly emerged from the woodwork to express their fake horror and absolute disgust. They shared the post hundreds of times across their own pages, adding their own fabricated stories about my supposedly terrible character. They called me a hood rat who got lucky and a wicked woman who was trying to steal generational wealth from a rightful heir. The church members chimed in with their hypocritical prayers, calling me a Jezebel and a spiritual parasite. I sat up in my massive king-sized bed and casually scrolled through the endless stream of toxic notifications. A normal person would have been completely devastated by the coordinated public smear campaign. A normal person would have immediately logged on to frantically defend themselves or posted a long emotional counterstatement begging the public to believe the truth. But I was not a normal person. I was a senior partner in forensic risk management. I looked at that massive, sprawling mess of public defamation, and I saw nothing but pure liquid gold. My bedroom door clicked open, and Amara walked in holding her sleek silver tablet. She was already dressed for her morning lecture at Spelman, wearing a crisp white blazer and dark jeans. She sat on the edge of my bed and tapped the screen of her tablet, sliding it across the silk sheets toward me. She had already written a custom Python script that was automatically scraping every single defamatory post, comment, and share across all their social media platforms. The script was taking high-resolution timestamps and archiving the data on a secure encrypted server in our basement. "They are extremely busy this morning," Amara said, her voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. "Heather just posted a new video of herself crying in her luxury SUV, claiming she is terrified for my physical safety, living under your aggressive, tyrannical rule." The video already has 4,000 views, and the church prayer warriors are organizing a protest outside our neighborhood gates. I handed the tablet back to her and stood up, stretching my arms. "Let them protest," I said, walking toward my massive walk-in closet. "Make sure your script captures the IP addresses of every single family member who shares the posts. I want full dossiers on their current employment statuses and any small businesses they might be running. By the time I arrived at my corner office at the Vanguard Tower, my legal team was already in a state of absolute high alert. My lead associate, a brilliant young lawyer named Marcus, was pacing back and forth in front of my heavy glass desk. He had a thick stack of printed screenshots in his hands, and he looked incredibly anxious. He immediately started rattling off legal statutes regarding libel slander and malicious public defamation. He wanted my authorization to draft a massive wave of aggressive cease and desist letters and send them via courier to every single person involved by noon. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and calmly opened my laptop. I did not look at his printed papers. I told Marcus to stand down completely. He stopped pacing and looked at me as if I had just lost my mind. He explained that allowing these horrible lies to circulate unchecked could potentially damage the pristine reputation of our wealth management division. He warned me that high-profile clients might start asking uncomfortable questions if the smear campaign went viral. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and explained the brutal reality of corporate warfare. Sending a cease and desist letter right now would only validate their fake victim narrative. It would give Heather exactly what she wanted, which was proof that she was bravely standing up to a powerful corporate bully. If we try to silence them early, we only get a minor apology and a deleted post. I do not want a deleted post, Marcus. I want to entirely dismantle their financial futures. I instructed my legal team to remain completely silent and invisible. I wanted Heather, Jamal, and Terrence to feel absolutely invincible. I wanted them to look at my silence and mistake it for crippling fear. When foolish people believe they are winning, they get incredibly sloppy and arrogant. They talk too much, they reveal their true motives, and they document their own malicious intent on permanent public servers. Every single lie they typed, every fake tear they shed on video, and every donation they solicited for their imaginary legal fund was just adding another massive zero to the civil damages I was going to collect. I was going to let them build a towering fortress of absolute lies. I was going to let them rally their pathetic flying monkeys and their hypocritical church friends. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of fake righteous triumph. Because the higher they climbed on their mountain of social media garbage, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally decided to pull the entire foundation out from under them. 3 entire days passed without a single word from my legal team or my firm. The complete silence must have been absolutely deafening for Terrence. He had thrown everything he had at the wall, hoping I would crack under the immense social pressure of his public smear campaign. He fully expected me to call him crying and begging for a truce to save my reputation. But when my office remained completely dark and my social media accounts stayed entirely silent, his fake, confident facade began to rapidly rot into desperate impatience. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when a courier stepped off the private elevator onto the 40th floor of the Vanguard Tower. He was holding a thick yellow envelope marked "Strictly Confidential." My executive assistant brought it directly to my heavy glass desk. I looked at the return address, printed in cheap ink, on the top left corner. It was from a law firm operating out of a strip mall located next to a discount tire shop in a highly run-down industrial area of the city. I opened the envelope and slid the contents out onto my desk. It was a formal legal letter drafted by some bottom-tier attorney demanding my immediate compliance regarding the transfer of the ancestral property belonging to Amara. But the legal letter itself was not the main event. Attached to the back of the official demand was a thick stack of printed financial ledgers and bank statements. I picked up the documents and carefully examined them. It took me exactly 4 seconds to realize what I was looking at. Terrence had actually gone through the immense trouble of fabricating fake bank records and internal accounting logs. He had clumsily manipulated spreadsheets to make it look like I had been quietly funneling millions of dollars from the corporate accounts of my clients into hidden offshore trust funds under my own name. There was a typed note paper clipped to the very front of the fake evidence. The message was short and dripping with arrogant malice. It stated that if I did not legally sign the conservatorship over to him by Friday afternoon, this entire packet of evidence would be anonymously leaked to the financial press and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He actually had the sheer audacity to write that he would hate to see the mother of his child go to federal prison and permanently ruin the bright future of our beautiful daughter. I leaned back in my high leather chair and let out a genuine loud laugh. The sound echoed off the floor to ceiling windows of my massive office. It was quite literally the most pathetic, clumsy attempt at corporate extortion I had ever seen in my entire professional career. As a senior partner in forensic accounting, I literally spent my entire adult life hunting down the most sophisticated financial criminals on the planet. I routinely dismantled massive international money laundering syndicates and tracked dark money through highly encrypted global tax networks. And here was Terrence, a man drowning in his own pathetic hidden debts, trying to blackmail me with a forged spreadsheet that looked like it had been edited by a middle school student who had just discovered basic accounting software. He had used the completely wrong banking routing numbers for the supposed offshore accounts. He had fundamentally misunderstood how capital gains taxes were applied to corporate wealth trusts. He had even misspelled the official registered name of my own firm on the fake wire transfer receipts. It was an absolute insulting joke of a forgery. But underneath the terrible fake documents was a much deeper psychological revelation. Terrence truly still believed I was the exact same terrified young girl he had abandoned in that hospital room 18 years ago. He thought I was still incredibly naive enough to look at a scary legal letter and instantly fold under the pressure. He thought my absolute silence over the past few days was a sign of paralyzing fear and submission. He honestly believed he held all the power because he had a loud voice and a cheap fake attorney willing to print out lies. He did not realize that threatening a senior corporate risk manager with fake financial crimes is the exact equivalent of bringing a plastic butter knife to a nuclear war. Extortion is an incredibly serious federal offense. By sending this specific envelope through a registered courier service across state lines, he had just committed federal mail fraud and officially documented his own felony blackmail attempt on thick physical paper. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the intercom button for my lead associate attorney, David. He walked into my office a few moments later looking eager for instructions. I handed him the yellow envelope and the forged financial documents. I watched his eyes rapidly scan the terrible spreadsheets and the blackmail threat. David looked up at me with an expression of pure professional disgust. He asked me if this was some kind of elaborate prank by a rival firm. I smiled and shook my head, telling him it was a genuine extortion attempt from my desperate ex-husband. David immediately asked if we should call the federal authorities and have Terrence arrested for felony blackmail right now before he could cause any real public relations damage. I told David to place the documents directly into the heavy iron safe in the corner of my office. I explained that having Terrence arrested by the police today would be entirely too easy and far too merciful. He would just cry to his hypocritical church congregation and claim he was a victim of a corrupt, wealthy legal system. He would go to prison, but he would still stubbornly view himself as a noble martyr who was just trying to save his daughter. I did not want him to just go to prison. I wanted him to willingly walk right into the absolute center of my corporate domain and experience the total destruction of his massive ego. I wanted Heather to stand there and watch his grand, wealthy facade shatter into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. I wanted Jamal to finally realize that the older brother he blindly worshipped was nothing more than a pathetic, broke criminal entirely dependent on stolen money. I instructed David to draft a very specific email to the strip mall attorney representing Terrence. I told him to make the tone of the email sound slightly panicked and highly accommodating. I wanted David to tell them that I was terrified of the impending public scandal and that I was completely willing to surrender to all of their legal demands just to protect my prestigious career. I told David to arrange a formal meeting for Friday morning right here in the main executive boardroom of the Vanguard Tower. I wanted them to bring the conservatorship papers so I could sign them in person and hand over the rights to the ancestral land. I knew Terrence would eagerly jump at the opportunity to force me into total submission inside my own corporate building. He would desperately want to parade his fake victory right in front of my powerful colleagues. David smiled a very sharp predatory smile and nodded in absolute agreement. He took the forged documents, locked them securely in the safe, and walked out of my office to set the trap. I turned my chair back around to look out the massive glass windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The storm was finally gathering, and Terrence was excitedly running straight toward the lightning, completely convinced he was the one controlling the sky. I left David in my office and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. I drove my car back to the Buckhead estate in complete silence, letting the hum of the engine calm my racing thoughts. When I walked through the heavy front doors, the massive house was completely quiet except for the low, constant drone of the server room down the hall. I walked across the marble foyer toward the heavy soundproof door and pushed it open. The room was freezing cold. I had installed industrial-grade air conditioning units just to keep the massive computer towers from overheating. Amara was sitting in the exact center of the dark room, illuminated entirely by the blue and green glow of 6 different massive monitors. She was typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking sound filling the chilled air. This was her true sanctuary. While other girls her age were decorating their dorm rooms with fairy lights and posters, Amara was building a digital fortress capable of dismantling international corporate networks. I walked up behind her and rested my hand on the back of her heavy leather gaming chair. I did not need to ask her what she was working on. Amara did not even turn around. She just kept typing, pulling up endless lines of complex code and hidden financial databases that normal people did not even know existed. "Look at this," she said, her voice completely flat and analytical. She pointed a slender finger at the monitor on her far left. She told me she had been spending the entire afternoon tracking the digital footprints of Terrence and his pathetic strip mall lawyer. She had intercepted the email headers from the extortion threat they sent to my office. She ran a trace on the IP addresses used to send the malicious emails and the pathetic social media posts from Heather. "He thinks he is incredibly smart," Amara continued, bringing up a map of the globe on her screen. She explained that Terrence was using a virtual private network to route his digital location through the United Arab Emirates. He desperately wanted everyone to believe he was sending his threats from a luxury penthouse in downtown Dubai. But the software he used was incredibly cheap and completely outdated. Amara easily bypassed the proxy server and unmasked his true physical location in a matter of seconds. A bright red dot flashed on the digital map of Georgia. He was not in Dubai. He was currently sitting in a rundown extended-stay motel located right off a noisy industrial highway just outside of the Atlanta city limits. He was hiding in a cheap room that charged by the week while pretending to be a global financial titan. I smiled, looking at the glowing red dot. But Amara was not finished. She told me the fake location was just the beginning of his pathetic web of lies. She moved her mouse to the center monitor and opened a massive decrypted file. She explained that she had used her custom algorithms to scrape the dark web and international financial registries looking for any legitimate business tied to his name over the past 18 years. She found his so-called crypto investment firm. It was nothing more than a highly leveraged shell company registered in a shady tax haven. A few years ago, he actually managed to convince a group of incredibly dangerous, unregulated shadow lenders in Dubai to front him a massive amount of capital to launch a fake cryptocurrency token. He promised them astronomical returns on their dirty money, but the token inevitably crashed to absolute zero because it was a complete Ponzi scheme. His investors lost absolutely everything, and the shell company was immediately liquidated. Amara pulled up a series of highly encrypted internal communications she had intercepted from the Shadow Syndicate. She translated the Arabic text for me, pointing to specific dates and numbers. The men Terrence had stolen from were not the kind of men who took financial losses lightly. They were a ruthless criminal syndicate, widely known for violent extortion and brutal debt collection. They had given him a strict, non-negotiable deadline to repay the stolen funds. The exact total of his debt, including the astronomical predatory interest, was exactly $12 million. Amara leaned back in her chair and let out a sharp, cold laugh. The sound sent a sudden shiver of absolute pride down my spine. She looked up at me with eyes that perfectly mirrored my own ruthless corporate ambition. She told me he was a dead man walking. He did not fly all the way back to Georgia to reconnect with his family or to assert his dominance over me. He came back because he was running for his miserable, pathetic life. The strict deadline to pay the $12 million was only weeks away. The ancestral land he desperately wanted me to sign over was his only possible way out. The corporate tech developers were currently offering tens of millions of dollars for that specific acreage to build data centers. He needed to steal the rightful inheritance of his own daughter just to stop a foreign hit squad from ending his life. I stood there in the freezing server room, letting the absolute magnitude of the situation wash over me. Terrence was not just a pathetic deadbeat father returning for a handout. He was a highly desperate criminal, bringing international danger right to the doorstep of his own family. Heather and Jamal were currently spending their entire week publicly defending a man who was actively dragging them into the crosshairs of a violent criminal syndicate. They were organizing church prayer circles and internet smear campaigns for a coward who was using them as a temporary human shield. They had absolutely no idea how deep the water was or what kind of monsters were swimming right beneath them. Amara pulled up another window showing the exact property deeds and the municipal zoning logs for the ancestral land. She explained how Terrence must have felt when he realized the property was strictly legally bound to her. He must have experienced pure absolute terror. He thought he could swoop in and manipulate a naive teenage girl and her struggling mother. He thought we were completely ignorant to the massive commercial boom happening in the suburbs. He needed us to be weak so he could survive. But we were not weak. We were the exact architects of his impending doom. He actually had the absolute nerve to stand in a hospital room 18 years ago and call Amara a useless financial burden. He looked at her like she was a parasite that would ruin his grand global future. Now that exact same young woman held his literal heartbeat in the palm of her hand. She was the only thing standing between him and total absolute destruction. I asked Amara to print physical copies of the intercepted Dubai communications and the exact loan documents showing the $12 million debt. I wanted to hold the physical proof in my hands. I wanted to throw the heavy stack of papers right across the mahogany boardroom table on Friday morning and watch his fake, confident smile shatter into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Amara pressed a button, and the high-speed laser printer in the corner of the room began humming loudly, spitting out page after page of undeniable hard evidence. She gathered the warm papers and handed them to me. I looked down at the Arabic text and the massive, terrifying numbers printed in bold black ink. I told her about the fake surrender email David had sent to the strip mall attorney. I told her about the formal meeting I had set up for Friday morning at the Vanguard Tower. I explained that Terrence currently believed he had successfully blackmailed me into surrendering her ancestral land. He truly thought he had outsmarted a senior risk management partner with a forged spreadsheet. Amara smiled a truly terrifying smile that reached all the way to her dark eyes. She closed the terminal window and turned her chair around to face me completely. She told me she could not wait to put on her best tailored suit. She told me she could not wait to walk into that corporate boardroom and look him right in the eyes when he realized who he was actually dealing with. This was no longer just a simple family dispute over a piece of land. This was a flawless corporate execution. We were going to let him walk into the Vanguard Tower thinking he was the absolute master of the universe. We were going to let him sit in the luxurious leather chairs and demand my signature. And then we were going to completely bury him alive in his own toxic debt without showing him a single ounce of mercy. I picked up my phone from the cold metal desk in the server room. I looked at Amara, who was still staring at the massive debt documents on her monitor. She gave me a single slow nod indicating she was ready. It was time to give the absolute performance of a lifetime. I dialed the phone number listed at the bottom of the pathetic extortion letter. I pressed the speaker button and set the device down next to the glowing keyboard. It rang 3 times before the line clicked open. "Hello," Terrence answered, his voice dripping with forced corporate authority. He was trying his absolute best to sound like a busy international executive who was annoyed by an unexpected interruption. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on my vocal cords. I forced my breathing to become rapid and incredibly shallow. I let my voice shake and crack with fabricated terror. "Terrence, please!" I gasped out, making sure I sounded completely unhinged and frantic. "Please do not send those documents to the press. You cannot send them to the FBI, Terrence. You will absolutely ruin my entire career and destroy the life I built for our daughter." A loud booming laugh echoed through the small speaker. It was the sound of a desperate man who suddenly believed he had just conquered the entire world. I could hear the faint sound of cheap motel air conditioning humming in the background of his audio feed. "Well, well, well," Terrence gloated, his tone dripping with sheer arrogance. "Look who suddenly remembered how to show some respect. I told you, Layla, I do not play games. When you mess with an international developer, you get completely crushed. You should have thought about your precious corporate career before you tried to keep me away from my own flesh and blood." I let out a loud, pathetic sob, covering my mouth with my hand to muffle the sound of my own amusement. I could hear other voices shuffling close to his phone. Jamal and Heather were clearly leaning in to listen to my absolute humiliation. "You brought this entirely on yourself, Layla," Jamal chimed in, his voice loud and aggressively confident. "You thought you were so much better than us with your fancy job and your big house. But the truth always comes to the light. You are just a criminal hiding behind a nice suit." I whimpered into the phone, playing the role of the defeated, broken woman they so desperately wanted me to be. "I will do whatever you want," I cried, letting my voice hitch perfectly. "Just tell me what you need me to do. I will sign the conservatorship papers. I will bring Amara and have her sign the transfer deed for the ancestral land. Just please, I am begging you, do not release those fake bank statements. My partners will fire me immediately, and I will lose absolutely everything." I heard Heather take the phone from Terrence. Her voice came through the speaker loud and sickeningly sweet. "Oh, Layla, it breaks my heart to hear you like this," she said, faking a deep tone of maternal sympathy. "But this is exactly how the Lord works. He always exposes the wicked and strips them of their false idols. We do not want to see you go to federal prison. We just want to protect sweet little Amara from your toxic financial abuse. This is all for the greater good of the family." "Yes, exactly," Heather Terrence agreed, snatching the phone back. "So here is what is going to happen. We are going to meet at a public notary tomorrow morning. You are going to bring the girl, and you are going to sign over the entire estate. If you try any of your aggressive corporate tricks, I am emailing this entire packet to the federal authorities before you can even blink." I knew I could not let him choose the location. I needed him to walk directly into the Vanguard Tower. I needed to use reverse psychology to make him demand the meeting happen on my home turf. "No, please, not a public place," I begged, my voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper. "The press follows my firm constantly. If anyone sees me signing over a massive trust fund at a cheap strip mall notary, they will start asking dangerous questions. Please, Terrence, I cannot risk being seen. We have to do this quietly. You have to come to my office at the Vanguard Tower. It is highly secure, and my partners will be out of the boardroom all morning. We can handle the transfer privately behind closed doors." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in his empty head. He was picturing himself walking right past the heavy security doors of the most prestigious financial building in Atlanta. He was picturing himself forcing the senior partner to surrender right inside her own luxurious boardroom. His massive, fragile ego simply could not resist the incredible opportunity to humiliate me in my own domain. "Fine," Terrence sneered, his voice heavy with arrogant triumph. "We will come to your fancy little office tomorrow morning at 10 sharp. You better have Amara sitting there with a pen in her hand ready to sign the land over to her father. Do not make me wait, Layla. I am a very busy man and I have a flight to Dubai to catch this weekend." "I promise, Terrence," I sobbed softly. "I will have everything ready. Please just bring the original copies of the documents and do not tell anyone else." "You are still the exact same weak, pathetic girl I left in that hospital room 18 years ago," he mocked, laughing loudly with Jamal. You are absolutely nothing without a strong man to put you in your place. See you tomorrow, sweetheart. The line went dead. The loud silence filled the freezing server room. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear and set it flat on the desk. All the fabricated panic and fake tears instantly vanished from my face, leaving behind nothing but pure absolute ice. Amara looked up at me from her glowing monitors. She had been tracking the live signal during the entire phone call. She tapped her screen, showing the red dot perfectly stationary at the cheap motel on the highway. He did not move a single inch. He took the bait. Amara said, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. He actually thinks he just broke the senior partner of a forensic risk management firm with a fake Excel spreadsheet. He did not just take the bait. I replied, feeling a deep, powerful calm settle over my entire body. He swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. He wants to play the role of the ruthless corporate conqueror. So tomorrow morning, we are going to roll out the red carpet and let him walk right up to the throne. I told Amara to get some rest and prepare her best tailored suit. The trap was perfectly set and locked into place. The enemy was marching directly toward our gates, completely blinded by their own pathetic arrogance. They thought they were coming to collect a massive fortune from a terrified victim. They had absolutely no idea. They were walking straight into an absolute financial massacre. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The Vanguard Tower stood like a massive fortress of glass and steel, piercing the clouds right in the center of the financial district. It was an intimidating monument to absolute corporate power. Down in the pristine marble lobby, executives in bespoke, tailored suits moved with quiet, urgent purpose. And right in the middle of this high society ecosystem stood Terrence, Jamal, and Heather, sticking out like a sore thumb. My security director had given me full access to the live camera feeds. I sat quietly in the VIP boardroom on the 40th floor, watching their pathetic arrival on my tablet. Terrence was wearing a different suit today, but it was just as tragic as the blue one he wore to the gala. This one was a shiny charcoal gray that stretched awkwardly across his shoulders, clearly rented from a discount formal wear shop. He kept tugging at his collar, trying to look comfortable while scanning the massive lobby with wide, greedy eyes. Jamal trailed behind him, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his chest, looking like a terrified intern on his first day. And then there was Heather. She stepped through the revolving glass doors, wearing a loud floral dress that clashed horribly with the sleek, minimalist aesthetic of the corporate building. She immediately began acting as if she was deeply unimpressed by the staggering wealth surrounding her. I watched on the silent video feed as she marched right up to the main reception desk. She leaned over the polished stone counter and began snapping her fingers at the young black receptionist, demanding immediate service. She probably assumed I was just a low-level employee who had begged her boss to borrow a conference room for a quick family meeting. The receptionist professionally checked their names and handed them temporary visitor badges. The badges specifically restricted their access to only the public areas and the designated meeting floor. Terrence snatched his badge with an arrogant smirk, completely oblivious to the fact that his every single move was being closely monitored by a highly trained security team. They walked toward the private executive elevators. The heavy steel doors slid open and they stepped inside the wood-paneled cabin. I switched the camera feed to the interior of the elevator. The ride up to the 40th floor took exactly 45 seconds. During that entire time, Heather did not stop complaining. I could read her lips perfectly as she whined to Jamal about the cold, soulless architecture of the building. She flapped her hands dramatically, criticizing the modern abstract art hanging in the lobby and comparing it to her own supposedly superior traditional tastes. It was a classic defense mechanism. Whenever Heather felt deeply inferior, she went on the offensive, attacking everything around her to mask her own crippling insecurity. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors glided open to reveal the 40th floor. This was the absolute apex of the Vanguard Tower. It was not a bustling floor filled with cubicles and ringing phones. It was a silent, highly exclusive sanctuary, designed specifically for the wealth management division. The floors were covered in thick imported carpets that absorbed every sound. The walls were lined with dark, rich walnut paneling and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city. Terrence, Jamal, and Heather stepped out of the elevator and immediately slowed their pace. The sheer oppressive weight of the silent wealth hit them like a physical wall. Terrence tried to puff out his chest and strut down the long hallway, but his cheap leather shoes squeaked awkwardly against the polished marble accents. Heather stopped complaining. Her eyes darted nervously across the pristine environment, finally realizing that this was not a place for cheap suburban drama. This was an arena for serious financial combat. My lead associate David stood waiting for them at the end of the corridor. He was wearing a flawless navy blue suit that probably cost more than the car Terrence was currently driving. David offered them a tight, professional smile that did not reach his eyes. He politely asked them to follow him to the main executive boardroom. Terrence gave David a dismissive nod, acting as if David was nothing more than an obedient servant, showing him to his rightful throne. David pushed open the massive double doors of the boardroom and stepped aside to let them enter. The room was breathtaking. It was easily the size of a small house, featuring a massive custom-built mahogany table that stretched 20 feet across the center. Heavy leather executive chairs lined the table, and the entire far wall was made entirely of glass overlooking the busy downtown streets far below. I was already sitting at the very head of the table. I did not stand up when they walked in. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply sat there in absolute silence, perfectly framed by the towering Atlanta skyline behind me. I was wearing a sharply tailored black suit with a simple silk blouse. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, tight bun. I had entirely stripped away any trace of the vulnerable, emotional woman they had spoken to on the phone just yesterday. I was completely composed, an immovable object made of pure ice. Terrence walked into the room and stopped dead in his tracks. For a brief second, his fake confident facade cracked. He expected to find me pacing nervously, wiping away tears, and surrounded by scattered papers. He expected a broken woman begging for mercy. Instead, he found a stone-cold executive sitting at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power. But his massive ego quickly overrode his basic common sense. He forced a wide, arrogant smirk onto his face and swaggered toward the table. He tossed his cheap briefcase onto the polished mahogany wood, completely disrespecting the pristine environment. Jamal scurried in behind him, pulling out a chair for Heather, who was staring at me with a mix of deep confusion and bitter jealousy. "Well, Laila," Terrence announced, his voice booming far too loudly for the quiet acoustics of the room. "I have to admit, this is a pretty nice little setup you have here. Did your boss give you permission to use the big room today? Or did you have to beg the janitor to let us in?" He laughed at his own pathetic joke, looking back at Jamal for validation. Jamal offered a weak, nervous chuckle, his eyes darting around the massive room. Heather crossed her arms tightly over her floral dress, leaning back in her leather chair and letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "It is incredibly drafty in here," Heather complained, shivering dramatically. "And this modern furniture is just so incredibly tacky. It lacks any real family warmth. But I guess we should not expect anything else from a cold corporate environment. Let us just get this over with, Laila. Terrence has very important international business to attend to, and we do not have all day to sit in this freezing room." I did not react to her ignorant comments. I did not defend my office or my position. I simply looked at Terrence, who was currently fishing around inside his cheap briefcase, pulling out the forged documents and the conservatorship transfer deed. He slammed the papers down onto the table and tapped the signature line with a cheap plastic pen. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the heavy boardroom doors had just softly clicked shut behind them, locking them securely inside the trap. Terrence stood at the edge of the massive mahogany table, tapping his cheap plastic pen against the highly polished wood. He looked around the breathtaking room again, shaking his head with a condescending and deeply arrogant smirk. "You know, Laila, I am actually surprised your bosses let you use a room this incredibly nice," he said, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "I figured a low-level paralegal like you would be stuck in a dark basement cubicle filing papers all day." But I guess they took pity on you knowing you were meeting a real international executive today. He leaned heavily over the expensive table and pushed the forged documents and the conservatorship transfer deed closer to me. I looked down at the cheap printed paper. The ink was slightly smudged from his sweaty, nervous hands. "Sign right there on the dotted line," he commanded, pointing the tip of his pen at the bottom of the page. "And then go fetch us some coffee. I like mine black, and Heather wants a vanilla latte with almond milk. We have been traveling all morning, and your firm really lacks proper corporate hospitality." I did not reach for the pen. I did not even look at the fraudulent documents. I just sat there perfectly still, watching him perform his pathetic little play. Heather sighed loudly from her plush leather chair, crossing her legs and closely examining her chipped manicure. "Yes, Layla, please go get the coffee," she chimed in, her voice echoing in the large room. "And make sure the milk is actually warm this time. We are doing you a massive favor by taking this heavy financial burden off your hands. The absolute least you can do is show a little basic respect to the man who is stepping up to save your daughter from your terrible parenting." Jamal nodded vigorously, leaning forward and resting his elbows right on the expensive wood table. "Yeah, Layla, do not make this harder than it has to be," he said, trying desperately to sound tough and authoritative. "Terrence is a very busy man. He has a massive financial portfolio to manage in Dubai. We do not have time to sit around while you stubbornly drag your feet. Go get the coffee and bring little Amara in here right now so she can sign the property over to her real father. Then we can all go our separate ways and you can get back to fetching coffee for your bosses." The sheer blinding arrogance of these three people was almost fascinating to witness in real time. They were sitting securely inside the most heavily guarded and powerful wealth management division in the entire state of Georgia. They were completely surrounded by billions of dollars in corporate assets and highly classified financial data. Yet, they genuinely believed I was just a glorified secretary who had begged her managers to borrow a fancy room for a quick family dispute. They looked at my tailored designer suit and my pristine work environment, and their insecure minds immediately downgraded my status just so they could feel superior to me. Terrence grew visibly irritated by my complete and absolute silence. He slammed his hand down hard on the table, making a loud slapping sound that echoed loudly through the large room. "Did you not hear me, Layla?" He barked, his face turning a dark, angry shade of red. "I gave you a direct order. Stop sitting there staring at me like a deer in the headlights and go get my daughter. I have international investors waiting for my call right now. I need little Amara to sign the deed immediately so I can legally secure the land and get back to my very important real life." He was a dead man walking. He just did not realize it yet. Men who are truly powerful do not ever need to raise their voices to command a room. Men who actually control millions of dollars do not sweat profusely through their cheap rented suits and slam their hands on tables like petulant children. They move in total silence. Terrence was screaming because he was drowning. He was aggressively projecting all of his crippling fear and his massive unpayable debt onto me. He was desperately hoping my quiet submission would magically save him from the violent shadow lenders waiting for him in the dark. I slowly lifted my left wrist and pulled back the sleeve of my tailored black blazer. I looked down at my heavy silver watch. The delicate hands indicated it was exactly 10:15 in the morning. I had specifically orchestrated this entire meeting to coincide perfectly with the arrival of my elite legal team. I knew Terrence would spend the first 15 minutes of the meeting puffing out his chest and barking empty, pathetic threats. I gave him that specific time on purpose. I wanted him to fully exhaust his fake bravado before I completely destroyed his alternate reality. "What are you looking at?" Terrence snapped, leaning across the table and trying to follow my calm gaze. "Are you checking the time to see when your shift ends today? Listen to me very carefully, Layla. If you do not bring Amara in here right this exact second, I am taking those forged bank statements straight to the federal authorities. I will have the police walk right into this building and arrest you right in front of all your fancy coworkers. Do you really want to go to federal prison just because you are too stubborn and arrogant to admit you failed as a mother?" Heather gasped softly, playing the perfect role of the horrified, innocent bystander. "Oh, Terrence, please do not send her to federal prison," she pleaded, her voice laced heavily with fake maternal sympathy. "Who will take care of Amara when Layla is locked away in a cell? We just want to help the poor girl find some stability." "Layla, please stop being so difficult and aggressive. Just sign the legal papers and go get the coffee like he asked. We are your real family, and we are only trying to protect you from your own terrible choices." I lowered my wrist and rested my hands gracefully on the cool mahogany table. A slow, incredibly cold smile spread across my face. It was the exact kind of smile that apex predators give just before they strike their helpless prey. Terrence saw the smile and stopped talking completely. His highly confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. He did not understand why the terrified, broken woman he had spoken to on the phone yesterday was suddenly looking at him like he was a pathetic little bug trapped inside a glass jar. "You are right, Terrence," I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly across the utterly silent room. "We really should not waste any more of your highly valuable international business time. You came all this way to see your daughter. You came here specifically to finalize the legal ownership of the ancestral land. I think it is only fair and proper that we bring the primary stakeholder into the room right now so you can explain your grand financial vision to her face to face." Terrence puffed out his chest again, his arrogant smirk returning in full force. "Finally, you are showing some basic common sense," he said, straightening his cheap gray tie. "Go get her right now, and tell her to bring a pen so we can finish this." I did not stand up. I did not move toward the heavy boardroom door. I simply reached forward and pressed a small silver button embedded directly in the mahogany wood of the table. The button connected directly to the private intercom system of my executive assistant, waiting patiently outside. The heavy silence in the room stretched out for 5 incredibly long, agonizing seconds. Terrence, Jamal, and Heather stared at me, fully expecting me to jump up and follow their pathetic orders. They were completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to open up and swallow them whole. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom did not just open. They swung wide with a heavy mechanical precision that commanded the immediate attention of every single person in the room. Terrence, Jamal, and Heather all snapped their heads toward the entrance, fully expecting to see a timid teenage girl awkwardly shuffling into the room to obey the harsh commands of her long-lost father. Terrence even adjusted his cheap gray tie, preparing to put on his best fake paternal smile. But the person who stepped through those doors was not a frightened child. It was Amara. She walked into the massive executive boardroom, moving with the kind of absolute fluid grace and terrifying confidence that usually takes corporate titans decades to perfect. She was not wearing the casual college clothes or the bright youthful dresses they had seen in the stolen social media pictures. Amara was wearing a pristine, bespoke dark charcoal suit, perfectly tailored to her tall frame. The fabric was incredibly expensive, absorbing the natural light pouring in from the massive windows. Her crisp white shirt was buttoned impeccably, and her dark hair was styled in sleek, flawless braids that fell perfectly down her back. She looked like an absolute force of nature. She looked exactly like a young queen stepping into her rightful throne room. And she did not walk in alone. Flanking her on either side were 3 men in dark, expensive suits. They were not security guards. They were 3 of the most ruthless and highly compensated corporate attorneys in the entire financial district. One of them was holding a thick leather briefcase, while the other 2 carried sleek digital tablets. They moved in perfect synchronization, with Amara projecting a massive wall of undeniable legal authority. They did not look at Terrence, Jamal, or Heather with any respect. They looked at them like they were annoying insects that had accidentally wandered into a sterile laboratory. The sheer suffocating aura of power that entered the room was immediate and physical. The smug, arrogant smirk completely vanished from the face of Terrence. His mouth actually fell open slightly as he stared at his daughter. He tried to speak, but his brain completely short-circuited, unable to process the massive discrepancy between the weak little girl he expected and the towering corporate executive standing right in front of him. Heather dropped her hands into her lap, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, completely deprived of oxygen. Her constant whining about the room temperature instantly stopped. She looked from Amara to the three imposing lawyers, and then back to me, her eyes wide with a sudden creeping terror. She could feel the dynamic of the room violently shifting, but her narrow mind could not comprehend exactly what was happening. Jamal physically shrank back into his plush leather chair, clutching his cheap rented briefcase against his chest like a useless shield. Amara did not rush. She took measured, deliberate steps across the thick carpet. The only sound in the massive boardroom was the sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels against the polished floor. She did not look at Terrence with love or longing or even anger. She looked at him with the exact same clinical coldness that a surgeon uses when examining a terminal tumor. She walked right past Heather, ignoring the older woman completely. She bypassed Jamal without even a single glance. She moved to the exact center of the long mahogany table directly opposite from where Terrence was standing. The three elite lawyers immediately fanned out, standing silently behind her chair like a highly trained royal guard. The lawyer on her right, who was the senior litigation partner of our firm, placed a sleek black folder directly in front of Amara. He did not say a word, but his presence alone radiated the kind of high-priced legal danger that makes ordinary men bankrupt themselves in sheer panic. Terrence stared at the thick black folder as if it was an active explosive device. Terrence swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. He tried desperately to regain his footing, to reclaim the dominant narrative he had constructed in his desperate mind. He forced a highly unnatural laugh that sounded thin and incredibly weak in the large, quiet room. "Well, look at you," Terrence stammered, pointing a shaking finger at her expensive suit. "Playing dress-up for your old man today, huh? It is good to see you, Amara. I know your mother probably filled your head with a lot of toxic lies about me, but I am here now to fix all of that. Come on over here and give your father a hug." Amara did not move. She did not even blink. She stood behind her leather chair, resting her hands lightly on the top edge. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. She looked at the shiny polyester fabric of his rented suit. She looked at the cheap, scuffed leather of Jamal's briefcase. She looked at the completely inappropriate, loud floral dress Heather was wearing. In just a few seconds of absolute silence, Amara completely visually dismantled their entire fake, wealthy persona. She saw right through the pathetic masquerade, and they knew she saw through it. "We do not hug in the executive boardroom, Terrence," she said. Her voice was incredibly smooth and completely devoid of any emotion. It was pitch-perfect professional and entirely devastating. Terrence flinched, as if she had physically struck him across the face. He looked at me, his eyes wide with rising panic, silently demanding that I intervene and force my daughter to show him some respect. I just sat there, resting my hands on the table, watching his pathetic reality completely unravel. Heather leaned forward, trying to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Now, Amara, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling with fake sweetness. "There is absolutely no need to act so cold and corporate with your own family. Your father flew all the way from Dubai just to make sure your financial future is completely secure. We just need you to sit down and sign this little piece of paper so he can take care of that messy ancestral land for you." "Listen here, young lady," Terrence suddenly shouted, trying to use volume to mask his skyrocketing terror. "I am your father. I have international legal rights. You cannot just march in here with a bunch of hired suits and disrespect me. I brought the transfer deed. Your mother already agreed to this over the phone yesterday. You are going to sign that paper right now, or I am taking this entire family to federal court." Amara slowly pulled out her chair and sat down, crossing her legs and leaning back with perfect posture. She let out a soft, chilling laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of any real humor. It was the exact sound a predator makes when it has completely cornered its prey. "You do not have the financial capital to take a parking ticket to traffic court," Terrence, Amara replied softly, her words slicing through the air like razor blades. "Much less take the wealth management division of the Vanguard Tower to federal court." Heather stood up from her chair, her face flushed with angry red patches. "This is completely unacceptable," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Amara. "You are being horribly aggressive and disrespectful. Layla, you need to control your child right now. We are offering you salvation, and you are throwing it in our faces." Amara turned her dark, calculating eyes toward Heather. The older woman instantly stopped pointing and slowly lowered her hand, physically shrinking under the weight of that deadpan stare. "Do not ever raise your voice in my boardroom again," Amara warned, her tone dropping into a low, dangerous register. "You are a guest on my floor holding a temporary visitor badge that can be permanently revoked by a single nod of my head. Sit down and remain completely silent." Heather dropped back into her leather chair as if her knees had completely given out. She looked at Jamal for support, but Jamal was staring blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by fear. The grand illusion was entirely broken. The true queen of the Vanguard Tower had finally arrived, and she was demanding absolute, unconditional surrender. The heavy silence in the room stretched out, becoming so thick it felt like it could crush the breath right out of their lungs. Terrence slowly turned his head away from his daughter and looked down the long mahogany table at me. His face was completely pale, and a thick bead of sweat formed at his hairline, slowly rolling down his temple. He opened his mouth and tried to form a coherent sentence, but his voice was nothing more than a ragged whisper. "Layla," he stammered, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. "What is the meaning of this? Who are these men? Who does she think she is talking to?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool, polished wood. "She knows exactly who she is talking to, Terrence," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "But I am starting to realize that you have absolutely no idea who is sitting across from you." I stood up slowly from my leather chair. When I moved, the three elite corporate lawyers standing behind Amara immediately shifted their posture in synchronized respect. Terrence watched their subtle movement, and the absolute panic in his eyes deepened. "When you first walked into this room, you asked me if my bosses gave me permission to use the big boardroom today," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the table. "You told me to go fetch your coffee. You assumed I was a low-level paralegal who had to beg for a temporary space just to accommodate your incredibly important international schedule." I stopped walking and stared directly into his terrified eyes. "I do not have bosses, Terrence," I stated, the words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. "I do not work for the executives in this building. I am the senior partner of the Wealth Management and Forensic Accounting Division. I built this entire department from the absolute ground up. Every single person on this 40th floor reports directly to me. This massive boardroom does not belong to my superiors. It belongs to me." Terrence physically staggered backward a few inches, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing weight of the revelation. His brain was completely short-circuiting. I could practically see the rusty gears grinding in his head as he desperately tried to process the impossible reality in front of him. The woman he had abandoned in a hospital bed with $0 to her name was not a struggling victim. She was the absolute apex predator of the Atlanta financial district. He looked down at his cheap plastic pen and the pathetic forged documents he had slammed onto my table just a few minutes ago. He suddenly realized the absolute staggering magnitude of his own stupidity. He had tried to blackmail the senior partner of a global forensic accounting firm using a fake Excel spreadsheet he probably printed at a cheap internet cafe. He had willingly walked into the most secure financial fortress in the city and handed physical evidence of felony extortion directly to the person who hunted financial criminals for a living. But I was not finished. I turned my gaze toward Amara, who was sitting with perfect posture, watching her father crumble with cold, analytical detachment. "And then, there is your daughter," I continued, gesturing gracefully toward Amara. "You came here today, assuming she was just a naive, easily manipulated teenager. You thought you could flash a fake smile and use a few paternal buzzwords to trick her into signing away her massive inheritance." The senior litigation partner, standing to the right of Amara, stepped forward. He opened the thick black leather folder and meticulously arranged several heavily redacted financial documents on the table in front of her. "Amara is not just my daughter," I announced, my voice ringing with undeniable absolute pride. She is the single largest private client this entire firm has ever represented. Her personal trust fund and her aggressively managed investment portfolio dictate the commercial real estate market movements in this entire city. She does not need you to protect her from financial liabilities, Terrence. She buys and sells men like you before she even finishes her morning coffee. Heather let out a high-pitched whimpering sound, covering her mouth with both of her hands. Her cheap floral dress suddenly looked even more ridiculous in the shadow of our overwhelming corporate power. All of her racist microaggressions, all of her condescending pity, all of the pathetic social media posts claiming I was a gold digger keeping a child away from a wealthy father, it all completely collapsed right in front of her face. She had spent 18 years acting like she was incredibly superior to me because she grew up in a fancy suburb. Now she was sitting in a room where the hourly billing rate of the lawyers standing in front of her was more than her husband made in an entire year. Jamal looked physically sick. He was staring at Terrence with wide, betrayed eyes. Jamal had always worshipped his older brother, believing the fake stories about Dubai and the massive crypto investments. But seeing Terrence standing there sweating and trembling, in a cheap rented suit, Jamal finally realized his brother was a complete, absolute fraud. Terrence tried to swallow, but his throat was clearly completely dry. He looked back and forth between me and Amara, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his impending doom was rapidly suffocating him. He owed $12 million to a violent international syndicate, and the only two people on the entire planet who had the capital to save his miserable life were the exact same people he had violently thrown away. 18 years ago, you stood in a sterile hospital room, I said, dropping my voice to a terrifying, lethal whisper. You looked at a bleeding woman and a beautiful newborn baby, and you called us a burden. You called us a massive, expensive anchor around your neck, holding you back from your grand international destiny. I walked right up to the edge of the table, standing directly across from him. I leaned in close enough to smell the cheap, overpowering cologne mixing with his cold terror sweat. Look very closely at the anchor now, Terrence, I whispered softly. He had absolutely nothing left to say. There were no more fake corporate threats to make. There was no more loud, arrogant boasting. He was completely stripped bare, standing in the exact center of the empire he could have been a part of if he had just been a decent human being. But the true devastation had not even begun yet. Terrence thought the worst part of his day was realizing I was a millionaire. He was about to find out that Amara had not just brought her lawyers to reject his property transfer. She had brought them to completely, permanently destroy his life. Terrence refused to accept the reality of his own destruction. His primitive survival instincts completely overrode whatever tiny shred of logical reasoning he had left in his brain. He lunged forward, slamming both of his sweaty hands flat against the polished mahogany table. He aggressively pushed the forged bank statements and the incredibly cheap property transfer deed across the wide surface until the papers stopped directly in front of Amara. He pointed his shaking finger at the signature line, his face contorting into a mask of pure, desperate rage. "You listen to me right now!" he barked, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his own panic. "I do not care how many fancy lawyers you brought into this room. I do not care what kind of fake corporate titles your mother gave you. You are still a teenager, and I am still your biological father. That land belongs to my family. It is my ancestral birthright. You have absolutely no idea how to manage commercial real estate, and you are going to ruin everything. You are going to sign that document right this second and hand the property over to me, or I swear I will make sure neither of you ever work in this city again." Amara did not even look down at the papers. She reached out with one manicured finger and casually pushed the forged documents off the edge of the table. The papers fluttered uselessly to the thick carpet, landing right at the feet of the senior litigation partner. Terrence let out a strangled gasp of pure outrage, watching his pathetic blackmail attempt literally get tossed in the trash. Amara picked up the sleek silver tablet resting next to her black folder. She did not raise her voice. She did not show any anger. She simply tapped the glass screen twice. Immediately, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind me began to darken. The automatic smart blinds descended in perfect synchronization, blocking out the bright Atlanta skyline. A hidden projector mounted in the ceiling hummed to life, casting a massive high-definition image directly onto the blank wall behind Terrence. "Turn around, Terrence!" Amara commanded, her voice echoing with chilling authority. Terrence hesitated, his chest heaving with ragged breaths, but he slowly turned his head to look at the massive projection. Jamal and Heather also turned their chairs, staring up at the bright screen in absolute confusion. The screen displayed a crystal-clear satellite feed of the ancestral land located in the outer suburbs. But it was no longer just an empty plot of overgrown grass and old trees. The entire landscape had been completely transformed. Massive yellow construction vehicles were moving across the graded dirt. Towering steel frameworks were already being erected in perfect geometric grids. And right in the center of the massive construction site was a huge digital rendering of the final project, featuring the unmistakable smiling arrow logo of Amazon Web Services. "You came here today to save me from the heavy burden of managing an empty lot," Amara said, leaning back in her leather chair and interlacing her fingers. "But you are about 6 months too late. I did not just sit on that land, Terrence. I conducted a comprehensive geological survey and rezoned the entire acreage for commercial industrial use." Terrence stared at the screen, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He could not comprehend what he was seeing. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "What did you do to my land?" "I leased it," Amara replied, her tone perfectly level and entirely merciless. "I signed a 99-year exclusive commercial lease with Amazon to build their newest southern data center hub. They needed the specific proximity to the Atlanta power grid, and I had the only viable acreage. The total valuation of the lease is $42 million. Heather let out a loud, choking sound, gripping the armrests of her chair, as if she was about to pass out. Jamal dropped his face into his hands, completely overwhelmed by the staggering numbers. $42 million was a sum of money they could not even begin to fathom. "You cannot do that!" Terrence screamed, turning back around and slamming his fists on the table again. "You are a child. You do not have the legal authority to sign corporate contracts. I will sue them. I will sue Amazon, and I will sue this firm. I will tie this up in probate court for the next 20 years. That money belongs to me." The senior litigation partner finally spoke, his voice deep and rumbling with absolute legal certainty. "You will not sue anyone," he stated calmly. "My team drafted the lease agreements." Furthermore, the entire $42 million payout was immediately secured into an ironclad generation skipping trust fund. Amara is the sole primary beneficiary, and the Vanguard firm acts as the unbreakable corporate trustee. The lawyer paused, letting the crushing weight of his words settle over the room. "Even if you spent the next 50 years filing frivolous lawsuits, you could never pierce the corporate veil of that trust," he continued. "You have absolutely zero legal standing. You have zero access. You could not touch a single penny of that money, even if you had an army of federal judges on your side. The land is gone, Terrence. The money is locked away forever." The complete realization of his absolute failure finally hit Terrence like a high-speed freight train. The ancestral land was his only golden ticket out of the massive hole he had dug for himself in Dubai. He had banked his entire miserable existence on stealing that property. Now the land was controlled by a global tech monopoly, and the money was guarded by the most ruthless corporate lawyers on the eastern seaboard. His grand master plan had completely shattered into dust. Terrence stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him. He collapsed into the leather chair beside Jamal, breathing heavily, as panic completely consumed his mind. He ran his shaking hands over his face, muttering frantically to himself. "No, no, no, this cannot be happening," he mumbled, his voice high-pitched and incredibly desperate. "You do not understand. I need that land. I need that money right now. They are going to kill me. They are going to find me, and they are going to kill me." Heather snapped her head toward him, her eyes wide with sudden terror. "Who is going to kill you, Terrence?" she demanded, her voice shrill and panicky. "What are you talking about? You told us you were an incredibly successful international investor. You told us you were doing this for the family." Terrence ignored her, completely lost in his own spiraling nightmare. He rocked back and forth in his chair, staring blankly at the mahogany table. Amara did not give him a single moment to breathe. She tapped her tablet again. The massive screen behind Terrence instantly changed. The aerial footage of the Amazon construction site vanished and was replaced by a series of highly encrypted internal communications written entirely in Arabic. Next to the emails was a scanned copy of a heavily notarized international loan agreement featuring the crest of a notorious shadow banking syndicate based in the United Arab Emirates. Amara stood up from her chair and slowly walked around the long table. She moved with deliberate, terrifying purpose until she was standing just a few feet away from her trembling father. "You have been lying to everyone in this room," Amara said, her voice ringing with crystal-clear authority. "You told your pathetic brother and his racist wife that you were a cryptocurrency billionaire. You let them go on social media and humiliate themselves defending your fake honor. But the truth is, you are nothing but a failed con artist. You borrowed a massive amount of capital from very dangerous, unregulated lenders to fund a fake token. And when your Ponzi scheme collapsed, you ran away like a coward." She pointed a long, elegant finger at the massive screen displaying the loan agreement. "You currently owe that syndicate exactly $12 million, she announced, making sure Jamal and Heather heard every single devastating syllable. "And the grace period on that predatory loan expired 48 hours ago." Jamal stared at his older brother with absolute disgust and sheer terror. "You brought international criminals to our doorstep," Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "You used us as a human shield. You made us attack Laila so you could steal millions of dollars to pay off a mob debt." Heather began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest and looking frantically toward the locked boardroom doors. She realized that her internet smear campaign had actively supported a man who was targeted by ruthless global criminals. Terrence looked up at Amara, tears of pure cowardice finally spilling down his cheeks. "Please, Amara," he begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic whimpering squeak. "You have $42 million in that trust. You can save me. You are my daughter. You have to save my life. I will do anything. I will sign anything you want. Just please pay them off." Amara looked down at him, her face completely devoid of pity. She did not see a father. She saw a pathetic liability that needed to be permanently liquidated. "I already paid them off," she stated quietly. The entire room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling projector. Terrence stopped crying. He looked at Amara with a sudden glimmer of desperate, stupid hope shining in his eyes. He actually thought she had taken mercy on him. He actually thought she had used her massive wealth to clear his name and save his miserable life out of some twisted sense of family loyalty. "You paid them," Terrence whispered, a weak, pathetic smile forming on his lips. "You saved me." Amara smiled back, but it was a smile colder than absolute zero. She tapped her tablet one final time. The screen flashed and displayed a formal corporate acquisition document bearing the official seal of the Vanguard Tower Mergers and Acquisitions Division. "I did not pay off your debt to save you, Terrence," Amara said, dropping her voice into a lethal, predatory whisper. "The Shadow Syndicate in Dubai was highly motivated to offload your toxic account because they realized you were completely bankrupt. So my Family Mergers and Acquisitions Division quietly reached out to them yesterday afternoon. We bought your bad debt for pennies on the dollar." The weak smile instantly vanished from the face of Terrence, replaced by a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. "We did not forgive your loan," Amara continued, leaning down so her face was just inches away from his sweating, trembling forehead. "We simply transferred the legal ownership of the debt. The Dubai Syndicate is no longer looking for you. They do not care about you anymore." Amara straightened her posture, looking her deadbeat father dead in the eye. Her voice resonated with the full, crushing weight of 18 years of vengeance. "You stood in a hospital room on the day I was born, and you called me a burden." Amara said, her words striking him like physical blows. "You said I was a massive anchor around your neck. Well, look at me now. I am the sole owner of your $12 million debt. I am your biggest and only creditor. I own your house. I own your car. I own every single penny you will ever make for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life." She paused, letting this absolute finality of her execution sink deep into his shattered soul. "You are finished, Terence," she whispered. "You are completely and permanently finished." Terence did not just collapse, he practically melted into the expensive thick carpet of the boardroom floor. His knees hit the ground with a dull thud, and his hands grabbed the edge of the mahogany table as if he was dangling off the side of a massive cliff. He was weeping openly now, loud, pathetic, gasping sobs that echoed miserably against the glass walls. He kept repeating the same broken phrases over and over again, pleading with the air around him. He begged Amara to reverse the transaction. He begged the corporate lawyers to find a legal loophole. He was completely broken, entirely stripped of his arrogant facade, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow shell of a man. Heather sprang up from her leather chair so fast she almost knocked it backward. The sheer terror in her eyes was completely authentic for the very first time in her miserable life. She gripped her cheap designer handbag tightly against her chest and looked at Jamal with frantic, desperate energy. "We have to go, Jamal," she yelled, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "We have to leave right now. Terence lied to us. He is involved with international criminals and the mafia. We have absolutely nothing to do with this mess. We are upstanding Christian citizens, and we need to get out of this building before we get dragged down with him." She turned toward the heavy locked doors, fully intending to abandon the brother-in-law she had spent the last 3 days fiercely defending on the internet. But before she could take a single step toward the exit, I raised my hand. "You are not going anywhere, Heather," I said, my voice slicing through her pathetic panic like a frozen blade. "You sat in my hospital room 18 years ago and mocked my pain. You launched a massive digital smear campaign trying to ruin my pristine corporate reputation. You really thought you could just throw stones at a glass tower and then walk away the second the glass started falling on your head." I turned my attention to the senior litigation partner standing behind Amara. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a thin manila envelope. He walked around the table and placed the envelope directly in front of Jamal, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, staring blankly at his sobbing older brother. Jamal slowly looked down at the envelope. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and peeled back the paper flap. He pulled out a thick stack of printed financial records bearing the official watermark of his own local credit union. "Look very closely at those pages, Jamal," I instructed, my tone entirely clinical and detached. "You spent your entire life worshipping Terence. You genuinely believed he was a global financial genius. But you were not the only one who bought into his pathetic illusions. Your lovely wife believed the lies too. In fact, she believed them so much she decided she wanted a piece of his imaginary international wealth." Jamal stared at the top page of the financial document. His eyes frantically scanned the bold black numbers and the official bank signatures. His mouth fell open in absolute shock. "3 months ago, Heather secretly visited your local bank branch," I explained, making sure every single word echoed clearly across the room. "She forged your signature on a massive loan application. She took out a second mortgage on your family home, pulling out exactly $200,000 in cash equity. She did not consult you. She did not ask for your permission. She just saw the fake crypto token Terence was promoting, and her own selfish, blinding greed took over." Heather let out a loud, terrified gasp, backing away from the table until her shoulders hit the glass wall. She pressed her hands over her face, shaking her head in frantic denial, but the undeniable physical proof was sitting right in front of her husband. She wired the entire $200,000 directly to the offshore shell company Terence created. I continued, showing absolutely zero mercy. "She dumped your entire life savings and the literal roof over your head into a Ponzi scheme. And when the fake token crashed to absolute zero, Terence did not return her calls. He kept the money to temporarily appease the shadow syndicate in Dubai. Your wife handed your entire financial future to a criminal, and your brother stole it without a second thought." Jamal stood up from his chair. The movement was incredibly slow and heavy. He dropped the bank statements onto the table, the papers scattered, sliding over the polished wood. He turned his head and looked at Heather. The look in his eyes was not just anger, it was complete, absolute devastation. The two people he trusted most in the entire world had conspired to completely ruin his life. "I did it for us, Jamal," Heather cried, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face and ruining her heavy makeup. "Terrence promised me the investment would triple in 30 days. I wanted us to be rich like Layla. I was just trying to build our family wealth. You have to believe me. He promised it was safe." Jamal did not say a word to her. He just let out a guttural scream of pure agonizing rage. He lunged forward and kicked the heavy leather chair, sending it crashing into the mahogany table. He completely lost his mind right there in the middle of the pristine corporate boardroom. He turned on Terrence, grabbing his older brother by the collar of his cheap rented suit and dragging him up from the floor. "You stole my house!" Jamal screamed, shaking Terrence violently. "You stole my house and you ruined my life! Give me my money back, you pathetic coward! Give me my money!" Terrence could not even defend himself. He just sobbed weakly, his head snapping back and forth as Jamal shook him. The toxic alliance had completely, violently shattered. They were tearing each other apart right in front of my eyes. It was a chaotic, disgusting display of pure human greed and betrayal. They were no longer pretending to be a high-class family saving a child. They were just rats turning on each other in a sinking ship. I watched the absolute destruction for a few more seconds, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. The terrified girl bleeding in the hospital bed was finally permanently avenged. I reached forward and pressed the silver intercom button embedded in the table. "Send security in," I said calmly. The heavy boardroom doors immediately swung open. 6 massive security guards in dark tailored suits marched into the room. They did not hesitate. 2 guards grabbed Jamal, peeling his hands off his brother and restraining his arms behind his back. 2 other guards hauled Terrence up from the carpet, dragging him by his armpits as his legs completely gave out. The final 2 guards flanked Heather, who was screaming hysterically and thrashing her arms, claiming she was a victim and demanding to call her church pastor. "Escort them out of my building," I ordered, turning my back on the chaotic scene and looking out the window at the beautiful Atlanta skyline. The guards dragged the screaming, struggling trio out of the boardroom. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, instantly cutting off the noise and returning the room to its pristine, peaceful silence. I turned back around and looked at Amara. She was already tapping her tablet again, shutting down the projector and closing her black folder. She looked completely unfazed, entirely composed. "Pull up the lobby camera feed," I said, walking around the table to stand beside her. Amara nodded and brought the live security footage up on her tablet screen. We stood shoulder to shoulder watching the silent video feed as the private elevator carried them down to the ground floor. We watched the elevator doors open in the grand marble lobby, but the security guards did not drag them out the front doors. They stopped right in the middle of the reception area. Waiting for them in the center of the lobby were 4 men wearing dark windbreakers. Printed in bold, bright yellow letters across the back of the jackets were the letters FBI. "You did not really think I was just going to lock those forged extortion documents in a safe and forget about them, did you?" I asked quietly, watching the scene unfold on the screen. When my associate David brought me the blackmail letter yesterday afternoon, I immediately had my team scan the forged bank records and the threatening note. I compiled all the evidence of the felony extortion attempt. I added the intercepted dark web communications regarding the massive debt to the Dubai Shadow Syndicate. I bundled the entire catastrophic package and sent it directly to a senior contact of mine at the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crime Division. On the screen, we watched the federal agents step forward. They grabbed Terrence from the security guards and immediately slammed him face first against the polished marble wall. Even without audio, we knew exactly what was happening. They were reading him his Miranda rights. The agents pulled his arms behind his back, and the cold steel handcuffs snapped securely around his wrists. He was being arrested on federal charges of international wire fraud, money laundering, and felony extortion. He was never going to catch that flight back to Dubai. He was going to a federal holding cell. Jamal stood in the lobby watching his brother get hauled away by federal agents. He looked completely dead inside. He turned toward Heather, who was weeping uncontrollably on the lobby floor, holding her hands up toward him and begging for forgiveness. Jamal just shook his head. He pointed a single angry finger in her face, clearly shouting words we could not hear. Then he turned his back on her and walked straight out the revolving glass doors, leaving her completely alone, surrounded by staring corporate executives. Amara closed the video feed and turned off the tablet. The screen went completely dark. It was finally over. The entire toxic bloodline had been permanently eradicated from our lives. We gathered our things and walked out of the massive boardroom, taking the private elevator all the way down to the secure underground parking garage. The air was cool and quiet, smelling faintly of expensive exhaust and polished concrete. Our driver was waiting right next to the sleek black Maybach. He opened the heavy armored door for us, giving a polite, respectful nod. We slid into the incredibly plush leather seats. The heavy door closed, shutting out the entire world in absolute soundproof perfection. The engine purred to life, incredibly smooth and completely silent. I looked over at Amara. She was looking out the tinted window, watching the concrete pillars of the garage slide past us. She looked strong, brilliant, and entirely unbreakable. We did not need to celebrate. We did not need to brag or gloat. We just sat in the comfortable, quiet peace of total, absolute victory. People always misunderstand the true nature of revenge. They think it requires screaming matches, dramatic confrontations, and violent emotional outbursts. They think you have to roll around in the mud with the pigs to prove you are stronger. But that is entirely wrong. The greatest revenge in the world is absolutely silent. It is the quiet, relentless dedication to building an impenetrable fortress out of the exact same bricks they threw at you to break you. It is about elevating your life to an altitude so incredibly high that the people who betrayed you cannot even breathe the same air as you anymore. We let them drown in the toxic poison they created themselves, while we sat comfortably at the absolute top of the world, untouched and completely unbothered. My name is Laila, and this is my story. If you have ever survived a massive betrayal or turned the cruelty of others into the foundation of your own empire, drop a comment below and let me know how you built your power. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute triumph and unapologetic success. Remember that your value is never ever determined by the broken people who were far too blind to see your potential. Keep building your empire in the dark, and let your blinding success be the only noise they ever hear.